Welcome to Talking Freire and Environmentalism, Ecopedagogy, where we talk about the needs, challenges, and possibilities of reinventing Freire and other critical pedagogues towards education for praxis for environmental justice and planetary sustainability, both for humans, but also beyond humans. It is hosted by the Paulo Freire Institute at UCLA, which is now in its 20th year and is part of a network of 15 Paulo Freire Institutes worldwide. I'm Greg William Misiaszek, and I am the Associate Director of the Paulo Freire Institute at UCLA. Today, I will be interviewing Cae Rodrigues. Cae is an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Physical Education at the Federal University of Sergipe in Brazil. He is a lecturer and researcher at the postgraduate program in Development and Environment, working in both master's and Ph.D. programs. His Ph.D. is in education at the Federal University of São Carlos in São Paulo, Brazil, with a 6-month scholarship at Monash University in Australia. Cae has had visiting researcher appointments at La Trobe University in Australia in 2018, at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia in 2019, and at the University of Lille in France in 2023. He has been editor of special editions for the Journal of Environmental Education. He has been a member of the Society of Qualitative Research in Human Motricity since 2005, and currently is acting as vice president of the society. He is founding associate of the Brazilian Association of Research and Postgraduate Studies in Leisure, ANPEL, and leader of the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Environment and Society, CIRES Brazil. So welcome, Cae. Thank you again for taking the time to have this little talk with us on environmentalism and Freire and ecopedagogy overall. So to begin with, we're going to kind of delve somewhat into the aspects of environmental pedagogies and ecopedagogy and Freire, but I guess my first question is, within like a 1-minute, 2-minute aspect, how do you describe your own environmental pedagogical work?
All right, so great to be here with you today. And just to get in environmental pedagogical work and Freire, I would say most importantly, I try to live up to the challenging idea of ecological praxis, right? So which means work is but an extension of my readings of the world, right? Of how I perceive the idea of what can be called ecological and how I act upon this idea. And of course, how I construct these ecological readings of the world is really intrinsically related to my studies on the topic. So my work has a deep influence also on my daily life. So my environmental pedagogical work, be it teaching classes in the university or doing research to develop ecopedagogies or giving courses to environmental educators in the Amazon, all of this is just me sharing this aesthetic, ethical, political construct that I live as praxis, right? While always, of course, learning in each of these interactions, right, with the individuals that take part in these encounters. So that's pretty much the challenging idea of living up to ecological praxis.
I really like that response. It sounds like you're living your own teachings, much like I'm thinking of Gandhi and Confucius and a bunch of other people, scholars in the past, but the aspect of actually living what you teach, or sometimes what you preach, some people say.
Yeah, and how work and life is really just one flux.
So within the theme about 1 or 2 minutes, how would you describe the aspects of ecopedagogy specifically? We're going to delve more into it, but how would you differentiate, say, ecopedagogy with other environmental pedagogies, and if in any initial connections with Freire?
Okay, so that's a bit hard to describe in few words, of course, because the meaning of ecopedagogy is largely connected to the history of ecopedagogy, which is intimately related to the history of environmental education, especially in Latin America, where the influence of Paulo Freire's work on environmental education is just remarkable. For example, the history of how environmental education is the predominant pedagogical current in Brazil, instead of education for sustainable development, for example, and how this is actually a decolonial political stance, right? It's there for a reason. This is very important to understanding the rise of ecopedagogies. Right? But really, to cut a long story short, I would say the dominant characteristics of ecopedagogies, the focus on ecological values, which means a focus on eco-aesthetics, on environmental ethics, on eco-politics, and all of this is an inseparable triad, and the influence of Freire's critical pedagogy. Right? And we could talk about this a little bit more later, because I won't do this in 1 or 2 minutes, but I would say that it's being the focus specifically on Paulo Freire's theory. Ecopedagogy is much more radical in its focus and in its propositions than, for example, environmental education, which has taken up too much in the last decades.
So maybe that's a great next question. How do you see maybe expand more on this aspect of Freire and environmental pedagogies and ecopedagogy in general?
So Freire has always been like an influence in my life, right? Starting from there. So my mother was a teacher. She used Freire's methods of alphabetization in her work. And really his ideals of a caring and dialogical education has always been present at home. Right? So the very same ideals are still present in my daily life today, in my interactions with my friends and with my students, with the grocery owner when I go shopping, or the doorman in my building, with my partner and my daughter at home. Right? So this is what praxis is really all about. Right? It's not about thinking a certain way. It's about understanding that thinking and being is all one of the same thing. So I could simply say that I use Freire's concept of generative themes and of knowledge from experience or meaningful learning and of critical political engagement or affectivity as education, right? I could say I use all of these as pedagogical tools, and these are concepts that are certainly present in my environmental work. But it's more than that, because I don't use these concepts as pedagogical tools. I really share those living experiences with the students in interactive ways of learning. And in doing such, an environment of co-creative knowledge is built, where learning is a process of incorporating that which makes sense to me, right, to my readings of the world, in my world context. And that's deeply connected to Paulo Freire, and I would say this is how really Freire is deeply connected to environmentalism.
Oh, wonderful! I love that, beautiful descriptions of it. So, in the classroom, how do you? What are your pedagogical approaches when you're teaching this to your students, or within any type of formal, informal, non-formal aspect? What are some of your pedagogical approaches?
Okay, very practically, essentially, I always like to start off by deconstructing, right? So really challenging those imaginaries that we already have kind of built in of what nature is, of what environment is, of what conservation is, of what sustainability or development is, right? And while challenging these imaginaries, I encourage the students to think about where those imaginaries come from, how they are related to their family culture, to their local, regional, national cultures, or to anything else that really might influence their readings of the world. After that, we collectively reconstruct these imaginaries critically, which means really considering different perspectives. And then finally, we co-create ways in which we can personally act towards what we believe in. Right? So there's action also in the end. So we really have conceptualization, contextualization, and representation kind of working together towards meaningful knowledge construction and political action. And that would be it kind of in a nutshell.
Wonderful. And you talk about imaginaries. How would you, knowing that Freire talked about this aspect of countering fatalism that's so prevalent, especially neoliberal fatalism. Now, how would you describe to someone what is imaginaries, and what is imaginaries with environmentalism?
Right. So this notion of imaginaries would come more, I would say, from my sociological background. So really looking at collective representations in the sense of Durkheim, so how we live in society and kind of incorporate the structures of this society, right? So as Paulo Freire would say, if this is not determinant, it's certain it's a conditioning actor, right? So the structure is a conditioning actor. So we bring into our experiences, we always bring into our experiences imaginaries from our histories, from our readings of the world, from our interactions with our personal environments. So for example, when I teach one of my classes on physical education and nature or environment, and I'm giving a surfing, we're doing an experience in surfing, we're on the beach and these students are there. Well, they come in with a built-in idea of what surfing is. And most of the time, this idea has a lot to do with the World League sports of surfing, right? They're thinking about going there and really get on top of the wave and doing these stunts, right? The way Gabriel Medina would do in the World Championship. So there's a lot to deconstruct beforehand if I really want to discuss surfing in other ways, which is not sport, right? Which is about just being in the water, which is just living with the waves, which is just experiencing that as a personal experience and not something that they already have built in and they're imagining doing in one certain way, right? So if they have this imaginary built-in, they aim only at that. So this is where I want to get at. And by aiming at only one goal, they're losing all other possibilities. So this is why we always deconstruct before really opening up possibilities, different possibilities of experiencing that in different ways.
I really love that example. It's a really great example. I remember about 25 years ago reading a book on, I think it was named Zen and Surfing. Maybe it was Surfing and Zen. And it reminds me of all the descriptions about how to, kind of the imaginaries of surfing through Buddhism and different spirituality and things like that. So within your work, is a specific, I know having read your work, you use a lot of critical theories and other different types of theories. Is there any specific, say, key ones that you return to in your work or in your practice of teaching?
Yeah, definitely there are central references. So besides Freire's critical pedagogy, I would say Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception has always been a very important influence since the beginning. So other important references are Manuel Sergio's Science of Human Motricity. So Manuel Sergio is a Portuguese philosopher. And so the Science of Human Motricity is also an important reference. Brian Fay's Ontological Limits to Change is really important, especially since my undertaking part of my PhD in Australia. That's where I really came to look at Brian Fay's work. Again, in Australia, Philip Payne, which was my supervisor during my PhD in Australia. So Philip Payne's, especially on the idea of phenomenological deconstruction and his ideas on ecopedagogies as well. From Brazil, A very important reference is Isabel Carvalho and her initially looking at ecological habitus, which comes a lot from Pierre Bourdieu, but also more recently ecological epistemologies, which is a concept she has been working more recently with. And even more recently, I would say all the eco-phenomenological references, such as Tim Ingold, Todd Tolvin, Maxine Sheets Johnston, especially with her take on the corporeal turn. So I would say there are plenty of other really important references that I could cite, especially in the realm of philosophy of education, like Michel Foucault, for example, or philosophy of the body. Sociology, like Pierre Bourdieu, which I mentioned, Durkheim, which I mentioned, more specifically environmental education and ecopedagogy. But I will say that short list, not so short, would do it.
Well, what a wonderful list. There's a couple that I really have to delve more into that I haven't heard specifically about, or the specific scholars. So really looking forward to looking into that. I think my next question is a more specific one, but it's on the second theory that you discussed, the ecomotricity. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And this question, just reading it from what I wrote down, last year in 2022, you presented a Freirean inspired ecomotricity. This was for a conference for the 20th anniversary for the Paulo Freire Institute at UCLA. Also was with University of Southern California, USC, and SOCA, University of America, celebrating also Freire's 100th year, and about the same as Pedagogy, the press's 50th year. Can you explain a little bit more about ecomotricity and its connections, or maybe there isn't too many connections with Freire?
There are. So that's another difficult question to do on a quick bit, but very basically, the concept of motricity, well, before ecomotricity, just the concept of motricity that comes from Manuel Sergio's Science of Human Motricity, which I mentioned. So it describes human beings, or how human beings create meanings as they move in the world. Right? So it's inspired mainly by Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception. Human motricity speaks to a world that is built through perception, which in turn is built through our interactions with the surrounding environment. So the way we move and the way we interact with the environment will define how we perceive the world. And here it's important to understand that our perception of the world is what we call our world. Right? This is very well aligned with Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception. Right? So there's no error in this construction, in the way Descartes would judge. And in the concept of motricity, the body is the only way to have a world. Right? And it's through the body and all its movements, holistically, including the mind, that we can build our world. So now ecomotricity is based on this concept, but it more specifically describes the ways we create ecological meanings as we move in nature. So again, different ways of moving in nature will generate different aesthetic, ethical, political perceptions of nature. Right? Can go back to the surfing example, or another example. Let's imagine a trail in a forest, which will be a very different experience of nature to a trekker, to a runner, to a cyclist, to a tourist, or to a local, to a scientist, to a hunter, to a native, etc. Right? So ecomotricity describes where and how ecological meanings emerge in each of these different interactions. So, and about the connections to Paulo Freire, there are many. It was actually the topic of a book chapter, which I wrote after the seminar in California. So ecomotricity acknowledges and is built upon the concept of knowledge from experience, right? The saber de experiência feito, in the term used by Freire, which is deeply connected to the concept of meaningful learning through the praxis of our interactions with the environment. Right? So I hope the book chapter is out soon, where this is really discussed in detail.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. It reminds me of what Freire asked, I forgot which book it's in, I think Pedagogy of Freedom. I'm not sure. When he asked a group of peasants, he asked, would there be a world without human beings? And he talks about this aspect of, that we construct the world through our history, through our experiences, through all these different aspects. And a lot of what I've tried to play with, and also when myself and Carlos Alberto Torres try to write this 5th chapter of Pedagogy of the Press, with this aspect of, the world and the rest of Earth, and how do those connections come about? So how do you see this aspect of environmentalism and this aspect of ourselves making our own beings, our own experiences, our own perceptions? What happens when those perceptions are that we're anthropocentric and we don't really have to care about the rest of nature? How does the eco part come into situations like that?
Well, that's really a
difficult question, I know.
It's a complex one, and what we have to look at is the world we are in now. So looking at that, if we only go about 50 or 60 years ago, we could say that this is where we kind of invented this whole idea of environment, right? That it wasn't in the way that we talk about today, and which we've come to incorporate today. It wasn't there before, right? So it's not something that we really need to imagine. We just really need to travel back a few decades to understand how we built a world without this perception of environment. And of course, if we travel a lot more back, it will be the opposite, right? If we go to indigenous populations, we have a completely different view of nature-human relations, right? Which is something we've been seeing coming back now in the academy, with indigenous theories coming into the academy, like Bien Vivir, or from South America, or Ubuntu from Sub-Saharan Africa, and Aboriginal theories from Australia. So really discussing how other possibilities of viewing human-world relations not only are possible, but they exist, right? They have existed and they still exist in certain contexts, right? On the other hand, we have Austrian researcher Ingolf Bluchdorn, which has a very interesting take on how we learn more and more. It's really what you are asking. We learn more and more to cope with the idea that we just are unsustainable. Right? So once we did invent all of this environmental concept, and we created an environmental discourse that really came into that wave of countercultural movements of the 60s and 70s. So there was something important there in terms of, look, we've had enough. The structure is really unfair, and we need change. And we had different movements getting into this, and the environmental movement was one of them. Right? So justice has always been very important in that sense for the environmental movement. Right? And with that, we had processes of environmentalization everywhere. We see that in law, we see that in our laws, we see that in construction, in education, right? And we come to incorporate the idea that sustainability is important. And what Ingolf Bluchdorn is now saying is that decades after this movement and incorporation of this, the incorporation of this discourse, at least to a degree, what we really see coming out of the big events, that frustration, that really the feeling of frustration that really is typically followed to those big environmental events today, really show how we don't have an international community that is really engaged to the big environmental problems. So he's really, what we see is the contrary, right? What we see is more and more the consolidation of politics of unsustainability and how we learn as a society to cope with the idea that we just are not sustainable, right? And that we can keep on living that way, maybe thinking about technologies to deal with it, but we don't really need to change our ways, right? So what we have, this is, let's go very free, Paulo Freire here, we have hope, right? We have hope,
Yeah.
and I would say, and Paulo Freire would say hope is, of course, not a passive term, it's an active term. And when I say we have hope, it's in what I see in my personal experiences, what I see in my work, is that people really, there's an aesthetic, especially an aesthetic shift that really take people to more and more wanting to be in nature. Right. So this is true in big cities. Has been growing, a growing aspect in big cities. We see schools like forest schools really growing, and we see these specific spaces in the cities that try to bring back the experiences of nature. Here in Aracaju, we have lots and lots of these little backyards that are doing afternoons with nature for kids and things like that. We see the big parks, we see the greening of cities, because really people want to be in nature. And I would say it grew after the pandemic, right? The pandemic was really expressive in that sense. So there's hope there. And this aesthetic shift, especially in the aesthetic shift of people wanting to be more in nature. And for that to happen, we need more nature.
Yeah.
Right?
I feel like that we should have another podcast on this whole topic. The things I came up with in my mind was varied, from Ivan Illich's Deschooling that came out, in the 70s. I talked kind of those few pages of the last chapter, started talking about a lot of these aspects. This aspect that another podcast, a video cast that we did was with David Epstein, and he talked about this aspect of using Nietzsche. And using Nietzsche's aspect of that to live, we have to forget the suffering and forget all these different aspects. And that coincided with the aspect of that we should just deal with the current situation of sustainability or unsustainability. How does that connect to hope, utopianism, and also this aspect that you began to talk about, is that a lot of people think, well, utopianism and Freire is just this fanciful thing. Utopia for Freire is very much rooted in reality. It's very much, realizing, it's going to be a struggle, but going towards a goal. But I guess my next question is very specific too. It's this aspect of justice, which you discussed a little bit about. We wrote an article together in Teaching in Higher Education, named the 6 Critical Questions for Teaching Justice-Based Environmental Education, that came out in I think the January issue of 2023 this year. And we co-edited a special issue on the same topic, which hopefully should be coming out in July. And so what are the ecopedagogical Freirean aspects that you see emergent from a special issue on how, what can we take on what, say, is the roles of higher education going towards environmentalism, ecopedagogical aspects, with, say, higher education going more and more, towards, say, neoliberalism or global neoliberalism, not as a whole, but it's definitely a huge influence. What do you see as, the trends, the possibilities of higher education, and what do they really need to do?
All right. I would actually start looking at our special issue and do a little comment about the assemblage methodology, right, that we used to elaborate the special issue. So that's where everyone involved in the process had the chance to read all the contributions, to suggest the possible edits, right, to co-create these bridges between their work and the work of other colleagues in the special issue. So this dialogical process not only makes for a truly special issue, right, in the sense of the name, like truly special. So it's a unit of knowledge on the theme, and not really a collection of fragmented papers talking about a topic without the effort of debating and building connections. But it also presents itself as a critical pedagogical process for everyone that was involved, right? So this was not only about specialists on the topic dictating what is important to say about it, which would be very similar to what Freire describes as a banking education, right? Where there's a deposit of knowledge in one side and someone to passively receive this knowledge on the other side. This was about really sharing experiences, right? Talking, yes, but also listening, right? And co-construct. So having to dialogue on another topic, having to dialogue with our 6 questions, right? I think it also challenged the authors to really think about contexts. I mean, this is very linked to Paulo Freire as well, right? And I believe this really moved the narratives in the special issue to a more grounded discussion, really acknowledging the potential limits to what is being proposed. And this, of course, minimizes those dangerous idealisms and abstractivisms, right, as described by Paulo Freire. So more than content itself, I really believe the process in which the special issue was built was very Freirean, right? And it showed. So many of those papers in the special issue, they acknowledge those challenges to a justice-based education, including many that were already discussed by Paulo Freire. Right? In terms of higher education, and this is another one that we could do another podcast about for sure. That I've been studying this since my PhD. So my PhD was exactly looking at how environmental issues are being incorporated into the curriculum of physical education curriculums in higher education. So this was 10 years ago. And there's another PhD from a university in the south of Brazil just this year doing a very similar thesis, which would be very interesting to see what happened in the last 10 years in that sense. Right? But speaking from Brazil, which is where I can really talk about this with more built knowledge, we see change. Right? We see lots of things happening, especially in the last 20 years. We see that in the laws, right? We see how those points that were there since Tbilisi, right, saying environmental education should be in all units, all disciplines, kind of in a transversal way. This is already very well incorporated into our laws, education laws, right? The laws that are defining our curriculum and education. And we start to see this in practice. Right? So I have had students in these last decade studying this in practice in different universities in different degrees of education, and we really start to see things popping up in different places and in different ways. Of course, this is slow, right? It's not as fast as we would want. It's not as fast as maybe it would be needed, but we really see the importance of, and this is something that are in the documents, in the laws, and that I agree very much with, having environmental issues discussed in higher education is crucial if we're looking to minimize the theory-practice gap, right, between prescription and description, right? If we want to see what the document says about it really happening in practice, we need people in different formations really incorporating the environmental discourse and bringing that to their practices. So just to end this up, I have students that have done their masters with me and now are coordinating environmental education in the state of Sergipe. Right? So then you see a transition there of people that have gone through higher education, have done a specialized study, a master's degree on the topic, and now they are there in practice and doing policy, right? So this is where higher education really will be very expressive in building a more environmental or sustainable world in the future.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I think the assemblage process was very powerful. Even though I think maybe the editors right now trying to do all the cross-citing and referencing might want to kill us right now. but yeah, I learned that from or experienced it from a special issue that you did with Greg, and I forgot his last name, in the journal Environmental Education. Am I getting I forget Greg's full name.
Lowen Trudeau, Greg
Mhm.
Lowen Trudeau from Calgary.
Yeah, so I think it was a very Freirean aspect, although there was a bit of resistance, I think, at the beginning sometimes, and I might have resisted it a bit at first too, because as a scholar, sometimes we're like, it's that we want to do the traditional route. We want to write what we write and then put it in a journal, but that interaction, I think, is so important, and I think with RSI it really came back to these. A grounding aspect of 6 questions plus sharing the papers, which I think was wonderful.
Yeah,
So just
we had
ask.
the authors really getting into it, which was really, really good. So along the process, I feel we had the
Yeah,
authors really getting into it and understanding, and of course it's a load more work, but I thought that the authors really got on board.
yeah, I think it definitely. I would say for ourselves as editors, I think from estimating it, I think it was pretty much probably 2 or 3 times more work than the typical SI, but I think it was definitely worth it. So in people discuss these aspects of Freire and the limitations a lot of times. The aspects of, say, Freire focused on class and economics. He didn't focus on race. He didn't focus on gender. And Bell Hooks
Yep.
has a very good article talking about that, defending Freire, but also defending that we're historical beings, much like Freire says we're unfinished beings. Carlos Alberto Torres just wrote an article about Freire's silences, on a special issue I did for educational philosophy and theory. So what are the limitations or maybe the needs of reinvention of Freire in going towards solving environmental issues in through education?
I think this is the kind of question that if you ask every 10 years, we'll have a different answer, right? Because
Yeah.
it's just like you said, we're historical beings and we live in our historical time, and we really, as discussed before, incorporate the structures of that time.
Mm-hmm.
So to look at where we may see limits to Freire's theories, basically we
Mm-hmm.
just need to see what went on in academia in the years after his death, right? So everything that
Yeah.
really came out and became very influential as discussion and academics and theory after his passing, close to 1997, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm.
These are places that his theory is going to have more limits. Gender, for example, was something that at his last writings he was already adapting, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this was a big discussion when I was in my master's, beginning of the 2000s, because
Mm-hmm.
the Portuguese language is very difficult, where we have male and female different words
Mm-hmm.
for male and female prepositions, and people really started to write everything in the double with female and male, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I would say a teacher, I would call she, but she also he, or he
Yeah.
also she, for everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when Freire was asked this in his last years living, he said, "Yeah, that makes sense." Right? So
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure Freire would adapt to a lot of these issues. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I would maybe think about talking was what was there in Freire, because I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't think to be, I wouldn't, it wouldn't be fair to Freire to do this as a criticism.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, we have all of these new materialism and non-human agencies, for example, and a lot of things that really came out and became influential discussions after his death, and that we need to adapt his theory as
Mm-hmm.
following researchers. We need to do the adaptations. It's our job now, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
something I try to do with ecomotricity. So this is where ecomotricity, following the ideas of ecophenomenology, will challenge some of those classic notions in phenomenology, and even in Manuel Sergio's original concepts of motricity. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to keep building, and this is our job now.
Yeah, definitely. And the key aspect of reinvention is so key to Freire's work. And I mean, there's been various scholars such as Peter McLaren and say Michael Apple and Wayne, all that talks about, that there's a lot of criticisms for Freire, but for every scholar. But some criticisms, such as there's a book that I won't say the author, but Freire as anti-environmental, is this aspect of, I think, reading a lot of the chapters of that book, and also the aspects of the not so valid criticisms, to say the least. A lot of times I see people as just reading Pedagogy of the Press in a superficial way even, and then just saying, oh, this is his work, where it's more this aspect that he built upon his work, much as he talked about we're all unfinished beings. So this aspect of theory too, and I was thinking this aspect of ecomotricity theory coming out of it all. Freire and others, Mr. Gododi talks a lot about this. It's this aspect that theory is useless unless there's praxis, action, and this aspect that theory comes out of living, out of being, and things like that. So you write, I wrote a specific question on this. You write on problematizing new post theories, especially representing global north, global south, theorizing epistemologies, knowledges, and so on in environmental teaching. Can you summarize some of these arguments, and if possible, link it back to Freire? But what are some of your aspects of problematizing, this aspect of post and new theories?
The main critique is on the remaining structures of academic colonialism, right? Especially on how the structures and the mechanisms for knowledge production still largely favor institutions, and by consequence, academics from the global north. Right? So that's the main critique. So just one example, if we look at top-rated journals, right? The language barrier is already a tremendous challenge, especially for non-natives of the English language. Right? And it's not only a challenge of English vocabulary, of English grammar. Right? The main challenge is really apprehending the structure of academic English and academic writing in English. Right? Which is totally different, for example, to the way we write in Latin America. So there's a whole history of education in that kind of writing structure, that you either had it or you didn't have it. You either learned to write in English in structure or you didn't. Right? And having to learn that afterwards is really difficult, because we incorporate that into the way, again, writing is a part of praxis. We write as we are, right? Latin America write as they are, as Anglo-Saxons will write as they are. So just very simplistically, but you will see in the English structure, or English written, academic written structure, it's very vertical, right? It's very objective. Right? It's just up, down. In Latin American writing, we really like to go around and go back to the topic. And so if you're an Anglo-Saxon and you're reading this way, it's boring, right? It's really unattractive. So you see how it's not only vocabulary, it's the structure of writing. So it's really difficult to overcome that and learn to write a different way, to really be contemplated by the reviewers of those top-rated journals, which are in the English language, right? Another issue is, of course, the difference in financial support, right, to do research in the global north and the global south, right? From the research itself to the publication of the research. Right? And even if submitting to a journal is free, it's very common that to make that publication open access, you have to pay a large amount of money. Some institutions, especially in the global north, will pay for the publication to be open access. Right? and papers that are open access. I know this because I work in a top-rated journal. I'm sure you know this because you work in top-rated journals as well. Those that are open access are a lot more likely to get a far greater number of reads.
Yeah.
So it's not surprising that the greater lot of new theories, and all of the post theories, I think they just come as examples, they end up being very influential. They come from the global north, right? And many of these become very influential also in the global south, because top-rated journals tend to lead to influential publishing. And being a critique to a form of colonialism as a system of oppression and of social conditioning, if not determinism, this is deeply linked to Paulo Freire.
Yeah, I mean, the issues of the Franco-lingua of English and other language too, but especially English, there's so many issues with that, especially with theory building and where, legitimate, where theories get legitimized and things like that, in the global north, and the problems with that, and the aspect of economics, especially. I love the example of the open access, because, it's kind of an idea that it's one of those ideas that, it kind of gets a neoliberal term where, it's wonderful, obviously open access is wonderful, but then who can afford open access? The same thing as who can afford these expensive journals. So going back to this aspect of justice and stuff like that, and I remember writing the editorial with you for the teaching in higher education, and really loved our process of writing it together. It's this aspect of reciprocal. Does justice have a reciprocal need? So, in Pedagogy of the Press, Freire discussed the uniqueness of human beings compared to the rest of nature. A lot of people discuss that as, that's an anti-environmental because it's this hierarchical aspect. And Freire went back, and he would have continued to go back, because his next publication was going to be on ecopedagogy, but unfortunately he died. But it's the aspect that, that we have, I would say, more of a stewardship, more of a responsibility, that us being able to reflect upon our dreams, our imaginaries, all these different aspects for our action. So and also taking another turn, say the eco-feminist Karen Warren, among others, talk about how justice has to be reciprocal. So we demand justice for each other, but if there's a hurricane, for example, that it isn't an injustice towards us, because nature isn't doesn't have reflectivity, as it's causing suffering upon human beings and upon the rest of animals and stuff like that. But that's only one perspective. And reading your work, I know that that you bring out different arguments, that this isn't so much that your take on this aspect of justice, on this reciprocal need for justice. I wanted to see if you could expand on this. And I asked this question because I'm very interested in hearing your responses too.
Well, I think what I would like to do is focus less on the need of justice being reciprocal, and more on what understanding justice, incorporating non-human beings, can do for us as a society, right? So in the science of human motricity, going back to Manuel Sergio, one of the fundamental concepts is how motricity is an exclusively human trait, right? So the idea of a world created through perception would be reserved to human beings, okay? And that makes sense, right? If we remember that Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception is the main influence of the science of human motricity. And in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, central concepts such as intentionality and transcendence, they are exclusive human traits, right? Again, we have to look at the history of when all of that was written, right? Now, ecomotricity will bring references from ecophenomenology and from indigenous theories to argue that other beings would also be susceptible to the same dynamics of perceiving the world through the way they interact with the environment. which would mean that their world would also be one of perception. So this is, we could say this is well aligned with the idea of how non-human beings have agency, which is by and large designed by their personal histories of interaction in the world. So going back to the idea of being reciprocal, there's no conscience there, but there is history. Even though justice is a human concept, if we acknowledge other beings have worlds of their own, the concept of justice implies that these beings have a right to keep in their worlds, right? As their worlds are their lives, and the right to life is a basic concept of justice. And indeed, we start seeing around the world even legal situations where the right to life of rivers and mountains, for example, are actually won in court, right?
Like Ecuador, right? And some other places.
Yes, like Ecuador, yes. So as ecopedagogy stands, this is really an important happening, right? In the sense of Michel Foucault, happening in the sense of Michel Foucault, right? As this is shaped as a unique situation that really challenges deeply naturalized notions of the relation between humans and nature. Right? So the ecopedagogical value of fighting for the life of a river, or fighting for the life of a mountain, in the same way we have learned to fight for the life of endangered animals, for example, it's really fantastic. Right? So again, I wouldn't focus on the need of it being reciprocal, but what this can do for us as a society. And on a side note, I strongly believe, going back to the idea of histories and Freire and the criticisms to him being anti-environmental in that sense of human uniqueness, I strongly believe that if Freire was living today, he would review his ideas of the uniqueness of humans from all else on earth. Right? So if we are unique, actually we are unique, right? There's no doubt about it. But we are not really any more special than other fantastically unique beings that compose the continuous symphony of the cosmos. Right? And I really believe that this is a statement Freire would agree on if you were present in today's debates on human-nature relations.
Yeah, and I think it's wonderfully said. I like that explanation overall. And I think that's what some of the, I would say most of the criticism, that there's a lot of good criticisms or critiques on Freire, but I think some of the superficial ones is this aspect that, that we, we continue to, reinvent our work and things like that. I remember at Beijing Normal University, Michael Apple said, I wrote ideology and curriculum, and my books after that was kind of reinventing those ideas in different aspects. I think that gets lost in superficial aspects of how Freire talked about utopianism or uniqueness of human beings, but also that it would have evolved. And it is too bad that he only left a couple of notes. Mr. Godoy, when I was in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, he said the notes that became Pedagogy of Indignation was on his desk. That talked about ecopedagogy, and some of that went into that book, but unfortunately he wasn't able to express everything.
Yeah,
so
he worked
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Freire worked very closely to Gutierrez, for example, right? And Gutierrez wrote Ecopedagogy. So many of the ideas that are there were discussed with Paulo Freire, right? So
exactly.
It is a continuation of his work, right? And it became very, very influential book to ecopedagogy.
Right? And that's a 1989 book, right? Was Gutierrez and Prado?
Yes, exactly. And that really gained traction when it was translated to Portuguese, because then it really met a lot of academics that were looking for just that kind of reference. So I think that was translated in the end of the 90s. And right 1 or 2 years later, Gadotti wrote his book, The Pedagogy of the Earth. So that was when Gutierrez and Prado's book was translated in Portuguese, it was important. It was also kind of a happening, right? Because it found a match in Brazilian academy that was just looking for that kind of reference.
Yeah, I had a wonderful breakfast with. They invited me to their house, Guterres and Prado, many years ago. And unfortunately, Guterres passed away a couple of years ago. But it's really too bad because I don't believe that book is still translated into English. And I've been trying to work with some people at Bloomsbury to try to get an English translation of that book.
I
It's
see.
unfortunate.
Mm.
So just two other questions, and then I just ask you if there's anything else that you want to add or anything that I didn't ask. If and this is kind of a hypothetical one, but if Freire was alive today, what do you think he would make of what has happened with environmentalism since his death in 97? Is there things that he would see as positive? And I would imagine there's quite a bit that he would see as negative.
Well, I imagine that the focus, if let's think if he would continue to work on what he left as his next project,
Mm-hmm.
I really imagine he would focus on exactly the same issues that he focused on education more generally, right? So meaningful learning of grounded knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
especially the kind of knowledge that challenges the injustices of the capitalist
Mm-hmm.
system, of the patriarchy, of colonialism, right? The kind of knowledge that really promotes a pedagogy of praxis through caring for other humans, caring for planet Earth, caring for life, right? In its multiple manifestations. So I really believe this is the kind of thing he would have picked up, which has a lot of his written work, but already with some of the more contemporary debates that are going on. Right? And
Mm-hmm.
about negative and positive, I have no idea because we do have, again, things that we look at and we wish that was going faster, right? That are
Mm-hmm.
really neat. But on the other hand, we see a different reality today. I see a different reality today than when I
Mm-hmm.
was young. And we have ways to the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the idea that's really present in Freire's work about affectivity, and I will go back to that, is really important. And I see a shift going on there that's something very positive. I think the affectivity towards how we as a society, uh, and this goes back to even leisure, right? The discussions in leisure or leisure, how we spend our free time and how more and more we want to spend that free time in natural environments. That's an important shift. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, how we do this is another topic, and this we have different ways. This is where ecomotricity really comes in to understand that there are multiple possible experiences and ways of experiencing nature. And this will evolve in different ways in the future. But just the aesthetic shift of wanting to be in nature is something that I really see as a positive shift for the future, and one that Paulo Freire would really be enjoying to
Mm-hmm.
see as an aspect of affectivity. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's always interesting the aspect of utopia, but also this aspect of cynicism too. I would imagine that there's various things that he could see as possibilities, but then I would imagine even just in the political public life, he would be disappointed about, say, Donald Trump being president or Bolsonaro
Yeah.
being presidency in Brazil, of all the things that has happened positive, these step backs too. And a personal question: what motivates you as we're talking about aspects of needing utopia, imaginaries, but also this aspect that I was told students that it's always need to have hope. Maximilio Teriosi talks about that as teachers we have to have hope. Why would we not teach? Why would we teach if there
Yeah.
wasn't some sort of hope that we have for the future for our students? It isn't that we're going to be most of us aren't going to be economically rich, super rich by the teaching profession. Sometimes we get disrespected in different ways. But what motivates your ecopedagogical work personally?
I would say that's an easy one because it's something I actually have answered before, including to my
Mm-hmm.
students. So I think what personally drives me is knowing how lucky I am from my world history, from my possibilities of living in this world the way that it happened, how lucky I am to see beauty in nature and really wanting others to delight in that same feeling, right? And when I say others, I mean other humans, but I also say other non-humans. And for that to happen, we need to do this as a planet, as a planetary society, right? So this is what motivates me, really wanting more people to experience this same feeling that I'm really happy to have, to see the beauty in nature.
Wonderfully said. And one last question is just, is there any questions that I haven't asked you that I should have, or anything that you want to express?
Maybe not something that you didn't ask, but one, if we have the chance for one last note, expanding a bit on talking about ecopedagogy and how ecopedagogy is different from the whole lot of theories and pedagogical currents out there, right? And here I agree with a Brazilian colleague, which you know, which is Ivo Dickman, that a really positive difference in ecopedagogy is how radical it is in its focus and its propositions, right? So environmental education was quite radical in its initial propositions. And if we go back to the first agendas coming out of Stockholm, coming out of especially from Tbilisi, if we look back again at the genesis of the environmental movement, contextualized within the wave of countercultural movements of the 60s and 70s, as I said before, right? That said we need change, right? But environmental education really ended up taking too much, right, along the years. So Lucy Salvé, for example, wrote that famous typology of currents in environmental education. It was 2005, if I'm not mistaken, so almost 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, the 15 of them.
She already identified 15 currents almost 20 years ago, right? So this is where ecopedagogy is really strong, right? It has in Paulo Freire a central reference, right? And that makes its goals very clear, as well as its limitations, right? Which is just as important. And these goals, they're very up to date, right? It targets the building structures of capitalism, right? As we've been hearing about the Capitalocene, right? Of unjust human relations that are still so encrusted in our institutions, right? And still so naturalized in our bodies that we express as forms of anthropocentrism, of patriarchy, of colonialism. And ecomotricity, again, really calls for affectivity in the form of a caring and loving education. So basically, if you are educated through violence, right, be it physical or symbolic violence, which Freire talked so much about, you will learn and you will reproduce violence. Right? On the other hand, right, if you learn through caring and love, right, you will learn and you will reproduce love and care towards everything. Right? It's not about caring for something specifically. Right? Ecological learning is not about learning to care for nature. It's just about learning to care for everything. Right? Caring for nature is just a consequence. Right? So I like the example of the Tamar project, which is a big institution in Brazil for the protection of sea turtles. Right? So it's really huge. It's a very successful project. But the sea turtle, it's like a symbol. It's like a flag. Right? What the project really aims is the conservation of the oceans. It's caring for the oceans. But you can't care for turtles if you can't care for an ocean. Right? These two things are one of the same. Right? So it's the same thing here. Right? It's not caring for nature. It's just caring, right, for everything. Yeah. Nature is just built in there. Right? So the message in ecopedagogy is very clear. If education does not tackle the problems of capitalism and of unjust social structures, it cannot be understood as ecological. Right? And that is really a strong point.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That responsive and thinking about all different things, coming back to aspects of the foundations of, say, peace education. How do we teach through, a lot of time through violence? Daniel Shogorensky, who's a Freirean, a well-known Freirean, he used to be at OISI, but now at Arizona State, who I just saw here recently in Mexico City. I remember one of his presentations talking about national anthems, and he did a whole analysis on, even the national anthems for countries. Most of them are talking about war, about, winning and, violence. And those things are important to know about our histories of, violence and things like that. But there's also other ways that have to go about it, and, what led to that violence? How can we prevent that violence and stuff like that? So thank you very much, Cae, for taking the time to talk today. Very much appreciate it. Great.
Let's do it again. If we have other topics, we have other topics that are coming out from this. Maybe we can do another one.
Oh, there'll be many. There'll be too many, and stuff, to say the least. But it's always wonderful to talk to you. Thank you, Cae.
You too. Bye-bye.